Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our last partner session of the day in this room. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the Evolving the Role of Technology in Government, sponsored by Deloitte, with Cecilia Hill.
Thank you.
All good.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to start with acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we meet today, and the Ngunnawal people. And I pay my respect to the elders, past and present, as well as extending my respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait people here with us today. Thank you for joining. We are really excited to be here today. I'm Cecilia Hill from Deloitte Digital. We do a lot of work with AWS, and we love the work that we do together in over 35 countries with more than 1,200 customers. We have 10,000 Deloitte staff actually certified on the AWS platform. And we're hoping that to increase much more in the coming years. But the most important thing and the most exciting thing that we do together in our partnership is an innovation program called the Gravity Challenge. If you haven't heard about it, it is a space-enabled innovation program where it actually blew my mind when I heard about it. We use space data to solve problems on planet Earth, which is pretty cool. And I think maybe Mark and Joanna will touch a bit on the data that we can use to solve problems today as well. If you're interested in it, please check out gravitychallenge.space. And there is an opportunity to put challenges forward and actually be part of the innovation process. So reach out and check it out. It's really interesting. But today, and while we're here, we have the pleasure to hear from one of our very dear clients, Mark Sawade, that will be talking to Joanna today. Joanna Valente is our federal and consulting lead partner for public sector in Deloitte. She's a dear friend of mine. She's big into rowing. She's been in this space for a long time. She did tell me not to tell you how long. But lots of experience in technology, strategy, and delivery. And she's joined today by Mark. Thank you, Mark, for coming. Mark is the CIO of Agriculture Fisheries and Forestry. Lots of experience in all things technology and government, I understand. Also has a love for sports, winter sports, and spending a lot of time with his kids on the sports field as well, which is fantastic. So thank you both for joining today, and I will hand over to you for an interesting conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, Cecilia. Thanks, Mark, for being here. Lovely to see lots of friendly faces. So Q&A, depending how we go with time, we'll throw to you as well, so you can ask Mark your own questions. But I'm going to certainly hog the space, Mark, and take advantage of the fact that I'm up here with you. The first question, your current role. You've been, I think, in the department for about 18 months. What attracted you to the role?
Yeah, it's funny how quickly time goes. Sometimes it feels like about 8 weeks, and sometimes it feels like about 8 years. But it's been about 18 months. When I started, it was the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment. I think one of the things that attracted me to the role, and probably also one of the biggest challenges, to be honest, was just the sheer diversity of the things that that department, we've now undergone a machinery of government change, and as per the slide, I'm now the CIO at the Department of Agriculture, Forestry, Fisheries and Forestry. But the department I joined, is just so incredibly diverse in the operations. So I'd talk to people, they'd say, "What do you do?" I'd say, "Well, where do I start?" We've got staff that are in Antarctica, and I'm responsible for the ICT and telecommunications equipment and all of the technology that supports staff for our Antarctic missions and our scientific missions, including last year the commissioning of our new vessel, the Nuina, so the icebreaker that we've now got and used to service voyages and undertake scientific missions through the southern Antarctic. We've got staff right up the other end of the country in Kakadu, Budari, and the other national parks that are actually run by the federal government, so some of our federal national parks. We had staff that are in each of the airports. The role that's probably most synonymous with biosecurity and the TV show that showed our officers standing side by side with the Australian Border Force officers and all the activities and the technology and the things that they undertake. We would have staff and scientists in our post-entry quarantine facility, which is in Mickleham, with both animals and pets, dogs and cats, plant, avian, equine for horses, all around quarantine, and how do we bring those things into the country. We regulate all of the agricultural goods that are exported and manage the relationship with trading partners and clear many of our agricultural goods for export and certify those on behalf of those trading partners. So when we certify and stamp that we meet the regulations for the high quality and high standard of goods and produce that we produce, that's something that is seen as incredibly valuable for our industry. And then we've got the policy and regulation side, both from import and export and environment, just a whole range of different activities that meant that it was such a diverse and interesting place to work. And with that, you can imagine the challenge of diversity of technology and the different use. It's not just a bunch of desktops with some storage and compute that are used by a bunch of people sitting at desks in an office building undertaking policy. It really is one of the most diverse organisations I've ever been involved with.
Fair enough. When you were actually, speaking of kids, when you told your kids you were about to start a new role, they would have asked you, what is it, I'm sure. Do you recall what might have excited them the most? What grabbed their attention? Antarctica, maybe?
Yeah, I think when you talk about Antarctica, it's probably one of the things that not just my kids, but most of our vendors go, oh, can you get me there as well? Because it is a place that you cannot genuinely pay to go to. You can pay to fly over the top of it, but it's not something you can just book a hotel stay and go and see it. So it really is quite different. But I think, the ability, to be honest, for the kids, you say, Dad, what does your department do? You'd say, remember that show Border Security? They go, oh yeah, I get it. So it's that stuff.
Completely. And the dogs, are the dogs yours or Home Affairs?
Yeah, so we also have the detector dogs that are used for biosecurity purposes. The Border Force dogs look for tobacco and drugs and cash and things, and our dogs look for biosecurity threats, so food and other things. So they're trained slightly differently, but they undertake the same job.
Beautiful. So thinking back 18 months, biggest challenge, sort of what's been really tricky and biggest successes?
Yeah, so certainly challenge was coming into an organisation. I started in February 2021, and the department was pretty much still new, in that it had only undergone a machinery of government change in February 2020, so a year prior, with the then Department of Environment and Energy and Department of Agriculture and Water Resources came together to form Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. And so we had two of everything. 2 networks, in fact, 5 networks. 5 networks, 2 different payroll systems, 2 different finance systems. If one department had a vendor that was black, the other one was white. Everything was separate. So, and that's not just a technology challenge, but that actually drives it drives cultural divide. When you're trying to build organisational capability and bring teams together, it actually drives a cultural divide when one half of your team is on this network with this login and the other half is on this one. Very simple things like just being able to join a Teams meeting, Microsoft Teams meeting that we'd use, which obviously became incredibly ubiquitous and common through COVID, where those on one network wouldn't be able to upload files, or they could participate in the meeting, but they couldn't use the same features because it was a different Microsoft tenancy that we used. So the technical divide actually drove a cultural divide in the organisation. So one of the big challenges was, how do you bring an organisation together where technically it was really complex and rooted in a lot of legacy around what you'd need to do to deal with to be able to make a change and do it quickly and efficiently, but not break anything.
And it's interesting, when we introduce tech, it's one of the concerns, as we know, is the organisational change considerations and potential risks associated with new tech. You're reminding us that actually new tech, or at least common tech, is actually critical for organisational change as well, and to really deal with culture, bringing teams together, etc.
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So that was that a challenge and a challenge and a success? Because
It
you've
was.
rolled out, what was the project? Was it the one desktop?
So we've got there was a lot of projects.
Yeah.
So it's like, well, we've got 2 intranets, we need 1 intranet. We've got 4 EDRMS systems, we need, 2 maybe at most. And we've got two different desktops and SOEs, we need 1. So we ended up coming up with a brand, and we called it Desktop One was our brand, and we ran an internal sort of naming competition inside our organisation to come up with the brand that would encapsulate this type of change. And so that when people heard about the brand, they knew that it meant, all right, these are the things generally that I use day to day at my fingertips to do my work that are now that are bringing us together. So incredibly challenging as a technology exercise, but really successful in the point that we're now deploying our Desktop One environment right across to people in now both of our respective departments. So not just in Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, but also in the new Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water, which is our now, I guess, sister agency that has come from our recent machinery government change. Great. So yeah, that was certainly a highlight. I think the other challenge goes with diversity. I walked in, and not surprising, but any time you've got, I think, operational diversity in your organisation, geographic diversity, it's really hard for common corporate IT to take a one-size-fits-all approach of this is the stuff I'm going to give you to get your job done. So inevitably and understandably, most of our business areas full of really, really smart people, particularly where we've got lots of scientists. Scientists love technology and data. They just buy their own stuff. They just do their own stuff. So shadow IT absolutely everywhere. As a result of largely, the corporate IT not being able to fulfil the demand where they could see that data and capability was out there, but they couldn't get a hold of it to be able to further, the work that as an organisation we were trying to drive.
Mm-hmm. So on shadow IT, the sort of the relationship between business and IT, all of us in either business or tech, or in both domains, know that this is, this is days of our lives at times, isn't it? It's a drama, it's poetry at times, but it's certainly a long-term challenge. It's wonderful when you achieve that continuous, high energy, collaborative culture. But what are your thoughts about what does that look like going forward? What does good look like in the way business and IT work together?
Yeah, this is something that was probably the first thing that struck me. Maybe first 2 months in the role, I was very deliberate in trying to understand, well, how does this place work and where are our challenges? What are the things we do well? And interestingly, a lot of the shadow IT was the really cool stuff. So leveraging AI through video capture, GoPros embedded in billabongs in Kakadu, and then running ML and AI over top of the video feed to be able to determine not just the different number of species of fish, but to be able to then understand the number of different instances of each individual species just through video capture. Working with drone technology to be able to undertake surveillance and then capture those data feeds and again run it through different models that had been built. This wasn't happening out of corporate IT. This was happening between our partners, our vendors, directly with our business areas. So you're like, well, I think so often a CIO or corporate IT comes in and says, shadow IT, I've got to stamp it out.
Yep.
I've got to get rid of it. I need control because, of course, I went up to talking to our staff who are from the Northern Territory, and they were like, yeah, we've done all this great stuff, but don't really know where to store this. So I went to JB Hi-Fi and we've got some hard drives. And so it's okay, they're here. And then I had a thought, Mark. I thought, we get cyclones in Darwin. This is terrible. What about disaster recovery? So it's okay, Mark, I've put it all in the cloud. So you can imagine as a CIO, the type of risks we start thinking through about, where did you put it? How are you going to, it's okay, Mark, it doesn't cost us anything. They're only going to charge us if we need to put it back out of the cloud. Right, so this balance between how do we think about the traditional risks and the reasons for us wanting to grab control versus how do you maintain the creativity and the autonomy and the passion and work out a model that actually sees that work in harmony. I think that's a perpetual problem, right? It's not new. But something that I thought really deliberately about, and as a result, we've come up with a model.
Shall I bring up a slide?
Yeah,
now?
well, yeah, we came up with a model that actually tries to build a balance between centralising everything and then sort of shadow IT or chaos. So this slide, this is really interesting. I needed to convey to my senior executive, to our secretary and all of our deputy secretaries, why the current world wouldn't continue to work, why we needed to change fundamentally. So a couple of choices. I could write a nice, thick, 40-page business case and, put or paper and say, here's why we need funding. Or, truly in the spirit of a picture tells 1,000 words or more, try and evoke some emotion through this. So I actually sat down with one of our vendors, one of our partners, and said, I need a graphic designer, I need a cartoonist. And I said, I need you to sit there and I'm just going to talk at you for the next 20 minutes and I want you to draw all the stuff that I talk about. And so we came up with this picture. So this picture was designed to talk about how stuff works now. And I said I wanted a bit of a Where's Wally type sort of, if anyone's familiar with the Where's Wally cartoons, lots of different stories happening on the page. And it was really designed to talk about the fact that we've put in place very deliberately a wall between our business areas and IT. And so IT sitting behind the wall there on the screen. And in front of the wall, we've got our business areas. And then we put in place some processes. We say to our business areas, well, you need to tell us what you want, requirements. So we ask them to write the requirements on the little envelopes, and we say they've got to tell us exactly what they want. Do precisely this, which is what's written on that envelope. And then we ask you to stuff it through our front door. But we don't have one, we've got multiple, there's multiple doors there. And then we pull it out and we unwrap it and we go, oh, actually, this has got to go to like 6 different teams in IT. So we tear it up and we put it on the conveyor belt and some goes here and some goes here and some goes here. And then we don't quite understand, so we have to sort of maybe post it back through and say, no, need more clarification on this. This is probably a classic description of, in some ways, waterfall versus agile. But for this, it was actually more about the way that we work together rather than the methodology. It was about the fact that we've got this complex set of processes behind the wall that's completely opaque to our business areas. It's the fact that our IT staff behind the wall actually don't get the opportunity to sit and be part of the actual outcome, the
exploration
and the solution. And we're passing status reports over and saying, sorry, it's late, and all of the things you can think of. We've got different buckets of demand. I like that one at the front there. And demand management was really interesting. We were blind, completely blind to the demand coming to us in IT. And these buckets sort of sat outside. We only saw it when they sort of either got poured over or they got stuffed through the envelope one by one, through the hole in the door. So this was designed to evoke some emotion. I think this is a really important message for when you're trying to work out how do you make significant shifts or change with an organisation. It doesn't have to just be government. I think any large organisation where that's the way we've always done it becomes a really prevalent sort of culture, is you have to evoke emotion, because we get stuck in logic and reading business cases and stuck here, but it's an emotional argument that will actually make people commit to, all right, well, tell me what different looks like. The choice we had, the choice I put in front was we can do one of two things. We can either try and fix this diagram. So I can take that messy conveyor belt behind, and what we'll do is we'll centralise all IT, get rid of all the shadow IT, bring it all in, and we'll make a perfect set of processes. Or we'll choose potentially a bit more of a radical path for a new CIO coming in, saying, actually, we're going to decentralise. I am going to create a model that will put you in control of your digital future. And we'll move some of our technology professionals and technology teams to be part of your business group, and we'll look at what does that model look like to actually deliver digital capability across both the back end, or we've called it wholesale IT that corporate IT will manage, and the retail ends, or the front end. So we've got this model we've coined wholesale retail. And the discussion then moved to, they said, oh, that sounds great. So you mean I can keep doing all my shadow IT? It's like, no, not quite. There's a lot of now responsibility you're going to take on for delivering this. So one of the key things was how our senior leaders think about their roles. So I pitched it like this. I said, traditionally, you own your part of the organisation, your business function, and remember our organisation's largely, there's a lot of operations in it. You own that business as an analogue business. You think about all the people and the process and the machinery and some of the technology that's required for you to execute your business, but you think about it as an analogue business. When it comes to digital, there was this person over here, CIO, Chief Digital Officer, whoever it is. Their job was to think about your business through a digital lens and to work with you to digitise or help, bring about a change and reform in how you use technology for your analogue business. So this model breaks that. You can't work like that anymore. You can't have one part of your organisation that's responsible for the digital lens across. So now, each of the deputy secretaries, each of the first assistant secretaries, my level, and general managers, you are your own chief digital officer. Just like we would ask any of our people who are senior leaders in the organisation to have a level of financial knowledge and accountability, the same now applies with digital. You don't have to be an IT expert. You don't have to understand how to build stuff. You don't have to understand all of the terminology, but you must understand your business as a digital business. You must understand your ecosystem. You must understand your stakeholders. So our stakeholders, the people we regulate, whether they're exporting agricultural trade or whether they're bringing things into the country, cargo and shipping companies, etc., they work with each other digitally, and then we insert ourselves in an analogue way. So what would it look like for us to insert ourselves as in a digital ecosystem? So really putting that back on our organisation to say, you now are your own chief digital officer. And in fact, maybe the exception to the rule is the analogue. Maybe we should have a chief analogue officer, I said facetiously. So that's a really big mind shift. That's not something you can do in one session. But this diagram was used to evoke the emotion about, well, actually, for probably a few decades, we've tried to fix this diagram. Yes. We've tried to make better process. We've tried to straighten out the kinks in the conveyor belt. And we've tried to bring some better process around transparency behind the wall and in front of the wall, when actually all of our operations now are digital. They're natively digital. So why wouldn't we have our teams natively digital as well? So that's the journey we've embarked on. We've started with one particular area of our organisation, our trade export teams, and been really clear around the fact that it's not about taking business people, the people that are driving and experts and owning our business areas, and saying you're now programmers. We still absolutely need our digital professionals, and our digital professionals have to find their identity as digital professionals outside of corporate IT. That was really tough, because there's something we had to be really careful about, because people go, well, hang on, if you're putting me in the business, am I still an IT professional? Do I still what? And the answer is yeah. You're no longer pigeonholed by which division you're in the organisation. Our whole organisation is evolving to where we have digital professionals in every area. So it's something that has been probably a bit scary. Plenty of times I've sort of thought, what are you doing, Mark? You're ceding control, but doing it in a way where we set some really clear rules And one of the rules is I make all the technology rules.
Yes.
So corporate IT sets the guardrails for how these teams need to work and operate. Really important.
Yeah. What surprised you the most when you engaged with the secretary and the deputies and your peer group? What was the initial reaction? Did anything surprise you?
Yeah, what surprised me is a group of people who are incredibly busy and their time is really valuable, chose to sit and talk about this slide to me. We went there one by one. They each told their story, and it often came out through as their pain that represented them from this slide. 40 minutes. 40 minutes we sat and talked just to this one slide where they shared what this felt like to them. That was so important. That's how you can make meaningful change and get buy-in. Because we can talk about the mechanics and the logistics and how we're going to change process and the funding that's required. To be honest, all of those things we can't define up front anyway. We have to be iterative in how we work through it. So that surprised me, that they didn't go, that's nice, Mark, pretty picture, next slide, I've got to get out of here. They were really keen to engage in this discussion.
Good. Speaking of demand and fiscal constraints, because digital is everywhere or technology is everywhere, massive advantages to productivity, to business value, to assurance, controls, etc. But obviously, the more you do digitally, the more units of something you're consuming. Now, of course, we're becoming more and more effective in the IT sector. The unit cost is going down. We've got cloud and automation, of course, really driving more efficiency in the use of core processing resources. How are you balancing the insatiable demand for more tech-enabled transformation and fiscal restraint?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think some of it is actually understanding what is the totality of consumption at any given point now, anyway. Because we generally tend to say, oh, again, let's look at corporate IT and see what's happening in there. How many servers have we got? How many AWS instances do we have set up? And how much money are we consuming with the things we know about? But actually, there's a whole bunch of stuff that was happening where we're spending money, and reflecting that and saying, well, if we're spending this much, what could we actually get for that if we approached it in a more holistic and consistent way? But it is a big challenge, and in particular in government, because traditionally our financial funding models for IT have seen us build assets. Whether we're buying an asset like a physical piece of hardware or whether we're building software, which we then classify as an asset, it's then uses capital expenditure, a particular flavour of funding that we get allocated a finite amount. And of course, as we've shifted incrementally to cloud, that is no longer an asset we own. So it's operating expenditure. So this isn't a new problem. It's one that's been around for a while, but I think it's still one that it's easy to lose sight of. How much are we consuming, and where is the funding stream to be able to maintain things ongoing? Where we managed capital assets, we generally get a chunk of money to do stuff, to build stuff, and then notionally you'd sort of run it for a while and then you'd refresh it at a point. If you were really mature and well run, we'd have a nice capital management plan that would map out exactly what assets we're replacing in which years over a nice 10-year cycle. Rarely were we necessarily that mature. But what it did was actually allow us to not maintain or pay the operating maintenance costs. We could make a choice where we had on-premise and our own infrastructure. We could make a choice about, are we going to patch it this month? Are we going to replace this bit of kit? Are we going to just run it a bit longer? So we could choose to avoid the servicing costs for our cars. I always like using the car analogy with our staff because it seems to resonate. I can choose whether I get my car serviced or not, but intuitively we know that if we don't, it's probably going to break at some point. So it's risk we take on. When we move to the cloud model, we don't get that choice anymore. It's actually built in to the monthly operating cost. And one of the great things about it is we don't get a choice, but it looks like we've got a higher cost. So when we look at funding and balancing demand, it's actually trying to compare apples for apples is really hard, because we can say, well, it used to cost us this when it was on-premise. Now it costs us this per month when it's in the cloud. But when it was on-premise, we didn't patch it, we didn't upgrade it, we didn't replace the hardware. So trying to communicate these, they end up being really complex concepts to distill it up to a level that when you're having a discussion with the CFO or with the executive board, that's a real challenge in being able to sort of distill and communicate how do you compare apples with apples, and are we spending more, or actually are we just now actually taking on less risk?
Absolutely.
Or both.
Is there recognition also by the executive that actually demand is going up? In other words, they need more tech to become better, to become better at the business that they're doing, and the return on investment, of course, can have a time frame that can take 2 to 3 years to realise the benefits.
Yeah, it's really interesting in that yes is the answer. So is there a sense that demand is going up? Well, all I hear about is demand. So I hear about, hey Mark, we've got these new 3D X-ray scanners at the airports. We can deploy these, and if we could just take that 3D model and put that into some AI and run ML over it, we'll actually be able to increase our detection rate and our throughput and create far more efficiency, right? One example. Using technology to help augment our existing operations is something that's just well understood across our organisation. In our post-entry quarantine area, where we take plant material in that's been set to be imported into the country, and we're quarantining it, we can run it through now a high throughput sequencing equipment that for one sample creates 50 gigabytes of data in the cloud, analysing all of the different types of pests and diseases and testing this sample against that to see whether or not it's okay. And we can do that in a matter of minutes, whereas previously that would have taken a long time, or we wouldn't have been able to achieve that same level of sort of detail. So it's well understood how technology can be used, but return on investment's an interesting thing in our game because it's about risk. So our job is to try and, in a biosecurity sense, and certainly our organisation now, we're managing risk of things coming into the country. So we can spend more money on more dollars on more IT that can help us actually deliver a much better risk profile. But that's not a saving. That's going to come at a cost. So now we've got to start working out how do you have a conversation about how much is risk worth? Yep. So some things where we can automate, you could trade it off by saying, well, where I used to have a person doing this, I could now do it in an automated way. But most of the time, where we're leveraging data and information, it's actually about reducing the risk to the country and to our industries, our agricultural industries. Really topical at the moment with the foot and mouth disease and outbreak in Indonesia, particularly in Bali, and the types of things that we're trying to do that we can do really quickly to address it. It's largely throw some money at having some more people and process in airports and asking passengers to be aware, and having shoes either left behind or washed when they're coming back in. But what can you do digitally, and how quickly can you do that, and how quickly can we respond? And so that's one of the real challenges that we sort of look at going forward is how do we create a set of infrastructure and capability that we can pivot really quickly to look at those types of things.
Okay, I'm going to share you with the audience in a second, Mark, in terms of questions. A question, cloud and automation. Obviously, we're all believers in it. We're at the AWS Summit today. What do you think are the must-get rights to really tap into the benefits?
Yeah, so this has been key. So I talk about that wholesale retail model, right? And you sort of break that up into thinking about wholesale, back-end stuff. So we still look after all of the server infrastructure, our cloud-based tenancies, and all of our networks and security, and then the retail being the development of software at the front end. The principle behind that model and why it works is you set guardrails that enable your retail areas, those areas of digital professionals embedded now with our business, to run as fast and as hard as they possibly can within those guardrails, to allow them to be creative, to to allow them autonomy and to be able to test, try, iterate, develop, deploy as quickly as possible without this diagram, without posting an envelope that now says, please deploy me dev environment here, put it through there, and then I'll sit back and wait for my dev environment. So automation for us in that sense and the use of cloud is actually fundamental. Yeah. So we've worked quite heavily in not just cloud being a default, I think that's sort of been a bit of a no-brainer, but actually the automation tools around infrastructure as code and enabling those retail teams to be able to provision and access their own infrastructure on demand so that they can be autonomous, so that they can be creative and iterate quickly. But with the rules that we set, we say this is exactly how your server environments are configured, and we know that they're configured the same way every time. So I think in that sense, automation is absolutely key to providing autonomy and being able to scale digital delivery across your enterprise, rather than saying, how do I bring it all back in and create the perfect corporate IT that's going to deliver it on behalf of everyone?
Great. So automation is the secret sauce for autonomy. Sounds good. Any questions from the audience? Okay, that was a fast hand.
There's a microphone coming. There we go.
What role, if any, does enterprise architecture play in your journey to decentralised IT?
That's almost like the perfect.
It is the perfect question for this gentleman. Yep.
I would say the most important.
Yeah.
So in terms of setting, I talk about guardrails because it's a language that our business areas sort of can understand and they can sort of picture guardrails. But technology guardrails, which is enterprise architecture, are absolutely fundamental, because the only way that I can cede control, if you like, of how these teams are building and what they're building and what is to have confidence in the things that are really important to our organisation. Cybersecurity, number one. Yeah. Things like how are things built in terms of how robust they are, high redundancy and high availability, and matching that to the workload that we have. They are governed through enterprise architecture. So in actual fact, enterprise architecture sits at the centre of our model. And the way if I was going to describe it in really simple terms, how I'd say it works, is we set a bunch of guardrails to start with. It says, well, these are the platforms you use. Here are the tools you use. Here are the languages you might use. And a lot of that might be based on our workforce and where our skills are, or perhaps even where some of our legacy is, or some of the things that we know. And then within that, fill your boots. These development teams can go and work as fast and as hard as they like. And the moment you want to go outside of it, that's okay. That's the first thing. So if you say it's not okay, you get shadow IT. They'll just go and find it. It's okay, but here's the process. And the process is our enterprise architecture governance. So it is providing a space to come and have a conversation that says, hey, we've learnt something, and we think one of your guardrails needs to be adjusted. We think we actually need to use this latest platform that we've learned about, or this new capability that's not part of it, or we think that actually we've made a wrong choice in some of our, and maybe we should rethink it. And so our architecture governance is set up to at least allow that conversation to happen. Enterprise architecture and corporate IT will end up making the decision on whether the guardrail is adjusted or not, whether there's an exception to the rule or not. But ultimately, you're making it part of, and to me, that's how enterprise architecture becomes a living, breathing thing. It's evolving based on the experience of the people at the coalface doing the development, rather than a bunch of people in an ivory tower who sort of say, here's how you're going to build stuff, and then the people on the keyboard are saying, yeah, right, I'll show you how to build stuff. So this is something that's, I think, a constant challenge. I can describe it like that. It says, wow, Mark's living in utopia. That's great. In reality, every day we face challenges where dev teams are saying, no, I don't like that. I don't like that vendor. Where I just came from, this product was much better. But we have a place and a way of dealing with those conversations. And we've got to have some discipline. Yeah. And part of that discipline is, at the end of the day, the rules are set by the CIO.
Sounds good. Another question?
Thanks, Mark. I'm ex-staff, now DEQ. And my question is actually about your utopia, as you just sort of described it, is working, I think, very well for our recently mogged organisation. What can we learn to help apply those principles and that approach at a whole of government level, given that we do have constant change, but also constant opportunities to learn and to understand and take what other agencies and other areas have been working on and bring that into the mix as well?
Yeah, great question. The whole of government challenge is one that, again, is not new, and how do we build and reuse capability, and why do we have some instances of where things we've done are incredibly successful as a whole of government identity is something that in our trade export systems we've just been able to take and use. One that a lot of developers or technical people would be familiar with, something that's been around for a long time, the DVS service. Yes. You know, an example of a really simple system where we drive reuse. Yet other things are so difficult at a whole of government level. I think part of the challenge is every CIO would sit here and you could ask us each the same question and we might have different answers, different flavours of answers. So to me, the role of the DTA is actually really critical and really important in helping bring together and filter the different views and lenses from different organisations. Because what's really important to our organisation, both in its previous and current form as a highly operational organisation, it's very different to what's important to an organisation that's largely focused on policy. My previous role at what was then Department of Education, Skills and Employment, outside of IT, I was the First Assistant Secretary for School Funding. And so, you know, what was important to me in a technology sense there was very different in my policy role and program delivery role as it might be to an organisation that's heavily got staff, as I said before, you know, it's in different roles all across the country. One thing I think that does serve well, and we're learning that I would apply to whole of government IT or architecture that is based around our internal wholesale retail, which is, and comes to the delivery of things as a service from one to another, is people are generally happy, and it won't be any surprise talking to a room full of people at an AWS conference and we're talking about it as a service, but people are happy to consume a service, or even be told you must consume this service where it's a commodity, where you just don't care about it. So again, when I try and explain this to our business leaders, I say, well, do you care about who makes your electricity or your gas or your water? You care about the retailer because they dictate price. But in terms of the wholesale, you don't care. You just say, I just want it, just give it to me. Now, IT in its genesis was never about commodity, but over time, more and more things further up our stack have become commodity. So I would argue 15 years ago, CIOs would say, do not tell me that I have to consume a whole of government email service. I want to manage my own email service. I want control. If it goes down, I want to be able to manage it. I want to know where it is. Whereas today, if I was told by the DTA, hey, everyone's just going to get in at australiagov.gov.au or at australia.gov as an APS employee for your email, and it's all going to come out of this cloud service, I go, sweet. One less thing I'd have to worry about. So using that principle of delivering things to the masses that actually people don't care about because they're a commodity, and working out the things that people really do care about, because there's either perceived or real sense of difference. And we all know that, you know, when it comes to our business, we can say, oh yeah, that's great for everyone, but mine's a bit different. Working out where that point is, that's what we've tried to do with our wholesale retail split. So our dev teams don't really care where their servers are stored, whether it's in AWS or Azure or wherever, or on-prem. They don't really care who's providing our WAN or our internal network. Is it Telstra? Is it Optus? They don't care if our gateway is MacTel or whoever. They just need that stuff to work. And so applying that principle, it works well internally. I actually think that can work well whole of government as well. I think there's a bunch of stuff as CIOs that we actually no longer care about, that we still do, that we could start to think about what would that look like to be delivered as a service. And then what that does is frees up all of our people to focus on the things that are really important to our citizens and to our country and sort of the mission and objectives that we respectively have.
Makes sense. One more question from you. Yes, one there. I'm just going to ask for a time check as well, because I don't have it on the screen. Great, thanks.
Thanks. That was awesome. Thank you. So a lot of that resonates, I think, with quite a lot of us. You've been in your role 18 months now, I think you said. You've sort of talked about this Northern Star, this vision. How far through are you into implementing this? I think all the things you've said are very apparent that we're trying to do too. And where have you sort of failed fast or learned fast on your journey to this sort of Northern Star that you're aiming for?
Yeah, great question. And so how far through are we? I don't think you ever finish. I think if you define it as with a start and a finish, it's a project. And people treat it like a project with a set of milestones and tasks. And this isn't a project, this is a culture change. Yeah. You don't finish a culture change. This is a mindset shift. Our people, our leaders, our staff, as I said, our technical professionals in terms of where they derive their value from, it all changes as a mindset shift. So I think that's a really important thing. It's a really good question though, because one of the things I hadn't mentioned is, so how do you go about doing something like this? I think traditionally what you do is you go, right, I'm going to get a wonderful partner like Deloitte, and we'll get them in and we'll help map it all out, and we'll create a schedule. Now we're starting to treat it like a project. And we're going to implement it. So we're going to, which sort of gives a sense of, well, yesterday I worked like this, and then today or tomorrow I'm going to work like this. Yeah. Whereas when you're doing mindset and cultural shifts, we know that if we actually talked about it as a cultural shift, that's not how we do it. So we very deliberately talked about how we would do this as incremental. We started with the part of our organisation in our agricultural trade reform group that was best positioned to work in this model in a wholesale retail. And we actually, so I've had a slide that I put up that would actually talk about this as a continuum, not an absolute. So at one end, we had some business areas that were ready, and or maybe even already, having digital professionals embedded to work in a wholesale retail split. At the other end, we had some business areas that either their lives weren't that complex or they just weren't ready. And they still needed corporate IT to do the entire stack, wholesale and retail. And that might be for the next 5 years that was. So we would, whilst we would seek to shift from one side to the other, from lower digital business maturity was the term we used, to high digital business maturity, that will take 5 years, 10 years, and in fact you don't ever finish. But actually making it okay, to say it's okay that we're not all operating the same way. So we picked an area of their organisation that was well-funded, well-structured, and it actually had a lot of digital professionals embedded, and said, why don't we let's build it out from here. And then where's the next business area? And where's the next business area? So by virtue of our machinery of government change, actually for the Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, pretty much we're at the beginning of now our whole organisation working in this model. But I certainly wouldn't pretend that it's anywhere near finished. And I think really we're just at the start. We'll continue to learn about which bits work, actually which bits don't, and how do we do this in a way that really achieves the outcome. The outcome, if we focus on the outcome, it's about just doing stuff faster, using data, using technology as part of our teams who get excited, who get creative, and delivering things for our country and our citizens in completely the opposite way to that diagram, which is how we've always done it.
Perfect, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? I've got one more myself. Okay. And I think then we'll wrap up and say thank you. Mark, there are a few of us here in the audience that are from industry. So a question would be, what infuriates you the most when you're working with industry, and what's your ask of us?
Yeah, good question. I think probably the thing from in terms of working with industry, the thing that is the most infuriating, and I don't think it happens that often, but inevitably there's pressures in the vendor side to meet sales targets or whatever. So being seen as a bit of a cash cow, particularly when an organisation where we were fortunate enough to receive government funding, and so trying to have every vendor get a piece of your time, regardless of the fact that we do or don't use that technology stack, really as a sales in can be really challenging. To be honest though, my focus is on building real relationships with our vendors, both the ones we use and the ones we don't yet, and working out where's the opportunity for real value. I actually think in government, we're, by virtue of a lot of the mechanics and the machinery that's set up through our procurement, through forcing us to be, quite rightly, it's taxpayer dollars, right? Absolutely transparent and defendable about why this company was picked or why we did this, actually can get in the way of just getting in a room and having a chat and saying, hey, I've got this problem, how would you solve it? Yeah. And so the ask from me is, when I'm meeting with industry, is to think of it through that lens, to sit down and have a discussion, get to know me as Mark Sawade, not just the CIO, of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry, and let's have a chat. I'm happy to talk about the problems and the challenges we face, and I'd love you to think about the parts of your ecosystem that make sense, and be really transparent about the bits that maybe don't, and where you'd work with other partners. Probably the number one thing that I get value from in spending my time where I do allocate time to sort of meet with industry are the stories about your customers, and they don't have to be the same. Doesn't have to be the US Bureau of Agriculture, or it doesn't have to be exactly the same government entity. Any customer where they've faced a particular challenge that sounds a bit similar to the stuff I'm talking about, and how that went, the bits that worked well, the bits that don't. To me, that really drives value, helps build that relationship, and means that when inevitably we approach the market or we're seeking partners, that we reach out.
Perfect. Please join me in saying thank you to Mark. Thank you, Mark.